A very good morning, Excellencies, Pro-Chancellors of Sunway University, Tan Sri Ramon Navaratman and Tan Sri Lin Sian, esteemed panelists, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the JCI Forum on Economic Performance Anxieties in East Asia. Please join me in welcoming Professor Graham Wilkinson, the Vice Chancellor of Sunway University, to deliver his opening remarks.
Distinguished guests, colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. A very warm welcome to you on behalf of Sunway University to this latest forum by the Jeffrey Cheer Institute on Southeast Asia. Our forum today is on the topic of economic performance anxieties in East Asia. I'm delighted to say we have a lineup of really distinguished and eminent speakers this morning, 8 of them, two chairs and six speakers. And they, of course, come from leading universities, research centers, think tanks, and we include amongst our speakers 2 former National Bank deputy governors and also 2 former ministers. So a very, very strong lineup of speakers for us all this morning. Asia is, of course, developing very strongly economically, but having said that, there are currently some significant, I think, geopolitical uncertainties around, also potentially some looming slowdowns, and I think this may be giving rise to possibly some storm clouds gathering on the economic horizon, and maybe that can give rise to some level of anxiety. Which of course is a theme of today's forum. Our event this morning is divided into 2 halves. The first half is devoted to the Southeast Asian situation, and that will be chaired by Tan Sri Professor Ghauth Jasmon, a distinguished educationist and, as you may know, the former Vice Chancellor of University of Malaya. So we will have Tan Sri Ghauth shortly. And the second half of this morning will be on the Northeast Asian situation, and that will be chaired by Professor Yoon Young Kwan, Professor Emeritus of International Studies at Seoul National University. So I'm delighted to welcome you all to this forum. I think amongst the audience we have a very broad spectrum of individuals from government, from policymakers, educators and researchers, as well as students, and of course the public. You're all very, very welcome to this special event today. I'd like to say a few words of special thanks. First of all, of course, to our distinguished speakers. Thank you all for coming. I know that some of you traveled a long, long way to be here and given up your very precious time, so we do appreciate that very much. I'd also like to thank our main sponsor, of course, the Jeffrey Cheer Foundation, for supporting the Jeffrey Cheer Institute and this forum. I'd also like to make a special thank you to Professor Wu Wing Tai, the president of the Jeffrey Cheer Institute on Southeast Asia, and of course all of his staff from the JCI who've worked so hard to put this event together this morning. And yes, let's have a good round of applause for them. So thank you to JCI for organising this event. So thank you all for coming. I hope we're going to have a really exciting morning, and I hope our speakers are going to dispense a few verbal tranquilizers to try and deal with these anxieties that they're talking about. So I certainly don't like the idea of economic anxieties. I think I'd like a tranquilizer if that's going to happen. Anyway, so thank you all for coming. I think it's going to be a very exciting morning. So I'd now like to hand over to Tan Sri Professor Ghauth Jasmon, who will be the chair of the very first session. Tan Sri Ghauth.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and a very good morning. Thank you, Vice Chancellor Graham. On behalf of the Sunway University and also Jeffrey Cheer Institute, let me again warmly welcome all of you to this forum this morning. I really look forward to a very lively session this morning, and we have lined up for you a very distinguished sets of speakers. And This is going to be a very difficult task for me, simply because, my background is education and engineering. But 3 weeks ago, Professor Wu wrote to me and he asked me to chair this session. So in the last 2 weeks, I've been doing a lot of reading on economics and I'm still on chapter 1, I think. Now, of course, when the president of JCI, Professor Wu, has ordered you to do something, you cannot say no, isn't it? Otherwise, your days could be numbered here. But anyway, it is an honor to accept this invitation. I do realize that these days I'm getting difficult tasks all the time, from time to time, I see one of my colleagues from Citibank is here, so I have to be very careful when I crack jokes on the finance world and so on. Because actually about 3 years ago, I underwent a very difficult 1-year interview process to be drafted into Citibank. Believe it or not, I had to go through 6 interviews, and halfway I knew that I'm not going to get it, but I don't know, miracles happen and I got it, So I'm used to this sort of thing. But today I hope to be a good moderator for the session. I hope if I fumble or say anything that is not wise or doesn't make sense, you'll forgive me and help me to understand things better. But anyway, before I say a bit more on the economic anxiety challenges for Southeast Asia, I'd like to introduce the 3 speakers this morning. So can I ask Tan Sri Lin Sian come upstairs, Professor Dato Tan Tat Wai, and Dr. Chalongphob. I'm going to introduce all of you first. From now onwards, I'm just going to call them by their names because people like Tan Sri Lin Sian is too long to use his titles, and he asked me to use his name. I'll just read his biodata. Lin Sian, a former banker, is a Harvard-educated economist and a British chartered scientist. He is a research professor at Sunway University and holds 3 graduate degrees from Harvard University, including a PhD in economics. Prior to 1998, he was chairman and CEO of publicly listed commercial banking group, having previously been a central banker for 34 years. After retiring as chairman of the Exco of Khazanah National in year 2000, he continues to serve the public interest, including member Prime Minister's Economic Council Working Group and member Competition Appeal Tribunal, as well as member of the Ministry of Education Committees and economic advisor, Associated Chinese Chambers of Commerce and Industry of Malaysia. In addition, Lin Sian sits on the boards of many publicly listed and private enterprises in Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, and Thailand, engaged in mining, oil and gas, plantation, manufacturing, real estate, hospitality and entertainment, ICT, food and beverage, executive education and power generation, as well as of universities and foundations. He served as Pro-Chancellor of University Science Malaysia for 10 years, from year 2000 to 2010. He is Chairman Emeritus, Harvard Graduate School Alumni Association Council at Harvard University, and is the President of the Harvard Club of Malaysia. So that is Lin Sian. The next speaker is Dr. Chalongphob Sussangkarn. He is Thailand's former Minister of Finance and is currently a Distinguished Fellow of the Thailand Development Research Institute, the organization for which he served as President from 1996 to 2007. He also served as an academic staff of economics at UC Berkeley and worked as an economist at the World Bank. He served as director of the regional project on indicators and analysis of vulnerabilities to economic crisis for the East Asian Development Network in 2002, and the Macroeconomic Model Project for the Budget Bureau from 2000 to 2001. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Cambridge. And the third speaker is Professor Dato Dr. Tan Tat Wai. Tan Tat Wai started his career with Bank Negara Malaysia in 1978, undertaking research in economic policies. Subsequently, he assumed the role of a consultant to Bank Negara Malaysia, World Bank, and the United Nations University for several years. He served as the secretary and a member of the Council on Malaysian Invisible Trade, set up to formulate policies to reduce Malaysia's deficit in service trade. He was a member of the government-appointed Malaysian Business Council, the Corporate Malaysia Roundtable, the Penang Industrial Council, the Industrial Coordination Council, ICC, and the National Committee on Business Competitiveness, NCBC, set up by the Ministry of International Trade and Industry. He represented Malaysia as a member of the APEC Business Advisory Council and sat on the Council of Wawasan Open University. So there you are, you have three distinguished set of speakers. We'll call Lin Xian and followed by the two others after this, and each of them will be given about between 20 to 30 minutes to say what they want. But before that, as a layman in economics, what I see as the anxieties myself, I would put it like this, and this is through my reading in the last 2 weeks. I'll just read to you what I think the issues that at least these three gentlemen should be touching on. The first issue is on the chronic debt to GDP ratio faced by countries such as Malaysia and the Philippines. External rather than public debt is the prime problem as it is denominated in foreign currencies, thereby exposing countries to external pressure. There's a need to reduce this deficit by cutting back on unnecessary expenditure. So I hope this would be commented by the speakers. Secondly, productivity slump faced by most of the Southeast Asian countries. Although there are serious problems with the measurement of this total factory productivity, or TFP, the IMF reported that most of the world's countries have recorded a trend fall in TFP since year 2005. Southeast Asia has also largely faced a trend fall in value added in gross output since 2002. The IMF also puts it to a trend fall in value-raising innovations. So I hope this will be another area that the speakers will touch on. Thirdly, the increasing threat of advanced technologies on jobs following the advent of Industry 4.0. In fact, Elon Musk, the Tesla founder, has said that the artificial intelligence, and now there's a project called super intelligence, is more dangerous than a nuclear warhead. With the advent of artificial intelligence, big data, and the Internet of Things, new technologies are replacing traditional jobs at a phenomenal rate. It is estimated that 50% of the jobs in the US will disappear in 10 to 20 years' time. Hence, the concern is the jobless growth prospect, which the proliferation of super intelligent robotics raises value added, but in the process, remove jobs. Fourth, excursion by some members, including Malaysia, from meeting the Paris Accord. This was in 2015, and the Marrakesh Proclamation, 2016, to reduce carbon emissions by 45% by 2050, as some have increased the use of fossil fuels instead, such as coal to generate energy. The targets are only 45% decarbonization by 2050. The main problems in ASEAN come from opposition from existing suppliers of fossil fuels. So this is another area which should be interesting to be discussed. And fifth, Trump has started to introduce protectionist policies since becoming president. Many countries are affected by this. Raising tariffs to him will shield domestic producers and at the same time will attract exporters from abroad to relocate operations in the United States. There may not be a full-scale trade war between the US and China, but it will reach levels to demonstrate its seriousness in honoring its election promises. Trump has taken the US out of the TPP, which is another issue. And lastly, the rising concern over escalating corruption in some ASEAN countries, which is also a big election issue now in Malaysia. The debt to GDP ratio is 1 and corruption is the 1. Some countries like Indonesia has done very well in the fight against corruption, but some others have slipped in the Transparency International ranking. Malaysia has fallen in the recent release of the TI ranking. Obviously, the issue would be investor confidence in ASEAN. So therefore, I hope this will be another issue that the panelists here will address. Now, gentlemen, you have between 20 to 30 minutes to present. I'll ask everyone to present first, and later we'll come up on board again, and we'll take questions and discuss the whole subject matter. So if I can now invite Lin Xian to do his presentation, and the rest of all, let us watch from the seat there. Thank you. Please, Tan Sri.
You know, I better let you all know well in advance. I'm not a believer in ASEAN. Although I was one of the founding people who started it, for the simple reason that I think it is overplayed. And if you look at the performance of ASEAN, I think it's rather poor. So in the sense that my presentation is a little colored because I think unless there's fundamental change in the way ASEAN does things, we will continue to see. Okay. So I will just do a broad sweep because the subject is so large that it is very difficult to really zero in on what interests you all. So I will try to leave us a lot of time for questions so that from your questions we can zero in on some of the areas that you all are interested in. As I said, I will just do a broad brush. I'll leave it to my two colleagues, the real experts, to talk about the details and things like that. First, just the broad global landscape. It's what most economists call a Goldilocks expansion in the global economy. Everything seems to be going on fine, led by the United States. I think the latest numbers coming out from the US look pretty good. And so this broad-based expansion will continue, close to 4% this year, next year. That's not bad for, and in fact, it is close to almost full employment, certainly in the United States, and closing on that in Europe, and to some extent Japan as well. What is interesting is that although the economy is doing very well, the politics somewhat stinks. And for the first time, markets are ignoring the politics. And so if you are an investor, if you look at all the major indicators, they are all up. But in recent months, there's return of volatility. But even then, underlying this volatility is very strong economic growth, low unemployment, and suddenly falling unemployment in Europe. And that has to be dealt with. And you can see last night, right, the Dow, when I went to bed at 4 o'clock, I think it was down 300 points. So volatility is something that is underlying the otherwise Goldilocks expansion. And then the thing that is coming on is what the economists call normalization of monetary conditions. As you all know, because of the recession 10 years ago, money is really cheap, right? In Europe it's down to zero. In Japan it's negative. And in the US it's 2%, 1%, and things like that. Now, when you have a major indicator down like that, you lose a benchmark. So everything is viable because you use the interest rate as your benchmark for discounting. I think this has been a matter of great concern to the Fed, and so now they are trying to normalize it. And I think my own impression is that even with new chief, I think interest rate will rise 4 times this year. But don't forget that we are at rock bottom. Even if it goes up 200 basis points, it's still nothing. Actually, it's still very low. So the perspective is important. As the chairman said, there's rising protectionism, but the prospect of inflation is important. Because as I said, the United States is already close to full employment, and on top of that, President Trump has put in 2 new vehicles to push growth, tax cuts and expanding on infrastructure. I think it's, in terms of timing, I think it sucks, because when you are full employment and the government runs huge deficits by pushing the economy further, inflation is almost inevitable. At the moment, it's very subdued, but it's just a matter of time, in my view. And of course, as the chairman said, there's protectionism. I think a lot of this is targeted at China, and it will become evident soon. So the prospect of a trade war is serious from where I stand. But so far, if you look at ASEAN, all trends look positive. But I will speak a bit more about it as we go along. So what's happening in ASEAN? Strong growth, almost 2 decades. It is a key driver of this Goldilocks economy in the global world, because as a group they are rising 5%, 5.5%, and that appears to is continuing. So they are a key driver together with China and India, driving the world economy, of course, with the United States, giving full backing. They have created in the last 2 decades a vibrant middle class and rising living standards. I just came back from visits to Indonesia and Philippines. Whew, everywhere is booming. And you can see it from the traffic. Manila traffic, we complain about KL traffic. Manila is worse, so it's the same with Jakarta. So, and Thailand as well, I just came from there, impossible. Yeah. But people are getting wealthy. And as a result of the strong growth and reasonably well-managed economies, there has been a lot of work at strengthening policy frameworks. And so that augurs well for the future. At the same time, most of the countries in ASEAN have adopted greater flexibility in the way they manage their exchange rates. And so they have more degree of freedom more to manage whatever downturn that may come. They are also embracing change and openness. But the landscape is shifting. It's shifting with tightening financial conditions because everybody fears inflation. because of rising protectionism. The protectionism that will affect ASEAN comes in two forms. One is they think what Trump is doing, you move soon to services. And for example, in the Philippines is one of the world's largest outsourcer of services. And so they are very worried in the Philippines. But at the same time, people like us, Indonesia, and Vietnam, we are part of the supply chain. And that is, these new tariffs are going to affect the way we're going to export and things like that. And finally, there are domestic vulnerabilities. As was mentioned by the chairman, there are high leverages in debts, especially corporate debt. Household debts are on the verge, in my view, at closing to the dangerous limit, but it's corporate debt that is of greater concern as far as I'm concerned. Fiscal deficits. Every country, despite the good economic conditions, are continuing to expand. I mentioned in Malaysia, whenever the economy slows down, I think we push more infrastructure, right? So the economy is what I call a bit sugar high. Yeah. And then continuing, what is unfortunate is that continuing income inequalities continue. So to relax you a bit, I like always to show a few caricatures to summarize what I've said. Well, this is the twin deficits. And he says, someone in Washington will ruin them in. Yeah, you hope. Trade war. This practically shows that nobody wins in a trade war. The key challenges, I think to some extent, I think the chairman has made my job very easy. I think we are talking about the same thing. I think there are four big challenges for ASEAN. The first one is how to manage risk and uncertainty. I define risk as known unknowns and uncertainty as unknown unknowns. So they are different things, and hence I separate them. I didn't mention this. As monetary conditions are normalized in the industrial world, we have to prepare for the impact on growth, on jobs, on income. Nobody knows what the full impact is going to be, but one thing is certain, we know it's coming and it is going to have an impact on us. And in that process, it is important to look at the big picture to avoid systemic failure, especially in the banking system, the financial system. And they are bound to be volatile capital flows. Not only because of economic reasons, but as the chairman mentioned, political reasons. And politics, as I say, the politics, not only in the world, but in Southeast Asia stinks. And because of that, capital becomes very volatile. And third, the need for reforms in order to inject greater resilience into the domestic economies. I remember reading Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman, who is a behavioral economist. And according to his surveys, he says if you ask 10 people whether they would change, 9 of them would say yes. But when you ask deeper and see whether they do change, 9 out of 10 don't change. And that's what happens to governments. Yeah, they say they will reform, they touch the surface, but they never reform. And without reform, there will be no resilience in the economy. And what you see every day in the newspapers are, as I said, all sugar high stuff. You give the economy enough sugar, like your kids, they run all over the place. You know. So this is a quotation from Lagarde when she visited ASEAN recently, and she mentioned this point, and he used this metaphor that the best time to repair the roof is when the sun is shining. Yeah. And so obvious, but as I said, people won't do it. But we have to keep on repeating it. The chairman talked about corruption. Yeah, I think it's not enough to just reduce corruption. There should be zero tolerance of corruption. I think that's what we should be aiming for. And finally, this is always a big gap in ASEAN. We tend to neglect the poor, we tend to neglect the disadvantaged, and our social safety nets. And it leaves much to be desired. This is the latest cartoon which I just saw in the Economies. And that's how Trump views the world. Whether we like it or not, he's a simple man. He doesn't listen to advice. He thinks he knows everything. He calls himself a genius. And I think that's how he's going to conduct his foreign policy. Yeah. The second challenge, making economies more inclusive. I think in order to do that, the first thing you have to do is to strengthen long-term growth. And there's no better way, I keep on repeating myself, no better way to do this but to reform. New approaches to growth has to concentrate on domestic demand, regional trade, and diversification. I think all these are things that I learned at universities, but they are difficult to implement. They are obvious, but difficult. And then, of course, the range and quality of exports. Malaysia in particular, we keep on doing the same thing year in and year out in our manufactures, while others move ahead. As a result, we are left behind. A classic example is a lack of strong value added in our manufacturing exports. In fact, at one time we were doing so well, but we have not kept up with the new technologies. And so as a result, we are losing the business in value adding for electronic and electronic parts exports. So I mentioned this inclusiveness, which is very important because the benefits of growth has to be shared more evenly. We need to have clear policies on how to reduce inequalities, not just by dishing out money when there is an election, but I think we have to go down deep into the causes of poverty. We have concentrated in Malaysia, we have concentrated so far on reducing absolute poverty. We have managed that, but now we have to look at relative poverty. But the upshot of it in the end is the next generation. I think we have to ensure that the next generation is better off. Many countries in ASEAN, there's still the demographic dividend to be reaped. I think certainly Indonesia, India, to some extent Malaysia, Philippines, and Vietnam. Chairman talked about productivity. It's true. So it's a trend all over the world. But the only way to get around it is you make special efforts and to invest in people and women, getting them into the labor force and getting them more equality in pay and things like that. So that's still quite a lot of work to be done. The last two, the third one is to prepare for the digital revolution. Here again, we say we do it, but we don't. Part of the reason is domestic protection, especially of our banks. If you look at banks in ASEAN, most of the local banks are protected. The central bank tends to protect this infant that don't seem to grow up. I have been in this business 60 years. The infant industry argument continues to remain strong. It's time for the infant to grow up. We should let go. Singapore had no choice but to do it, and so DBS is doing extremely well in the region. Moving out, and in order to survive outside Singapore, they had to digitalize. But if you look at Malaysia, you look at the banks, they're still talking of bricks and mortar, you know. I was just in New York. Everything I buy, suddenly Starbucks, my favorite place, I just swipe my handphone. No sweat. In China, everything is on Alipay and 10 cents version of this. We are lagging behind. And it's high time that, so I especially dig this up because it's important. The chairman mentioned to that. McKinsey says that 60% of today's jobs will be automated. Those of you who work in the private sector, you know that 60% probably is the minimum. Many of the jobs actually can be done by robots or the new technology. And I was talking to my friends last night that I just came back. I sit on the board of Asian Institute of Management, and we are putting a lot of resources today in the teaching of data science. I think that's the area for the future, big data. And from there, you get to know how people behave and how and everything comes with. Of course, he has his advantages, but I think we are slow in this. Most universities are not teaching data science. Yeah. So we need to improve the digital infrastructure and to be aware of the impact of the new technologies, from AI to robotics, biotechnology to fintech, and I just mentioned data science. But in all this, we have to be careful that as we do the digitalization, we have to keep that human face rather than let the machines take over. There's always this danger of going too far. And a lot of this has to do with education. I'm one of those that in my inputs to the Ministry of Education, I've always keep on stressing the need to study the humanities, the arts, and the sciences. I think it is highly important that our kids put on a human face as they do their work in IT and digitalization. And then, of course, like everything else, you have to manage this transition. Once it's clear how you digitalize, this transition to the digital economy, and how to harness this ecosystem. The end game, growth and productivity. I think Chairman talked about how to get productivity. That's it. We have to do this. I sit on the board of Silver Lake, Southeast Asia's biggest software company, especially in the banking side. The demands for digitalization, certainly outside Malaysia, is so huge that we cannot get enough programmers and software developers to do this. Part of the reason is the education is not good enough. And so we recruit them, you might be surprised, from Egypt. They have first-class people being trained at Alexandria and Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe, yeah. And finally, step up regional cooperation. I think we have been talking this for 60, 70 years, you know. The trouble with ASEAN is that two things, in my view. One is there is no cohesiveness. There's no, it's not like the European Union, you know. The ministers meet and then they agree on certain things and everything has to be done country by country, not integrated. And that's the problem. I know our good friend Surin, when he was Secretary General, tried to do this. It's impossible. He tells me it's impossible. Yeah. So although it looks very good on paper, in practice, it is very difficult. Part of the reason my diplomatic friends get very annoyed with me is that ASEAN is really driven by diplomats. And you know, diplomats love to talk. Yeah. They are not driven by people who do things. And this is part of my gripe against ASEAN. But it is something which the advanced country needs as a cushion against China, against Japan. Southeast Asia is their friend to cushion all this political and economic developments. And of course, part of the economic cooperation involves non-tariff barriers. That's impossible. Although as a group they agree to do that, but when it comes to individual, classic example is food imports and exports, right? Everybody have their own rules, and they stop everything else to protect the local, despite agreement on tariffs. Cross-border labor mobility is a problem, and of course, we need to strengthen the anti-corruption framework within ASEAN. And finally, I think we need to listen. I think that's a wrong word there, not leaving. That's the trouble when you dictate it to a secretary, you know? Yeah, among ASEAN, getting more listening and so on. So that's my take on ASEAN, a broad brush. A lot of problems still, but I leave it to my two colleagues to sort out the details. Thank you. That's one of the advantages of speaking early. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. My presentation, I will talk you through data. So it's really looking at figures and tables and so on. But I hope that they will show some sensible story. So the first table is on ASEAN economic performance. And this table shows the average annual growth rate of real GDP for 2005 to 2010, 2010, 2015, and then for 2016 and 2017. If you look at this table, you see that the newer ASEAN member countries, there's a CLMB, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam, have been performing very well. They're growing 7% and so on. And this is good, because if we're talking about ASEAN integration, you can't integrate if some countries are left further and further behind. It will lead to all kinds of negative impacts. For example, if Thailand grows well, but the neighboring countries don't, then the outcome would be that we have a lot of migrants from a neighboring country coming to work in Thailand, whether legally or illegally. So it's good that the newer member countries and the poorer countries are growing faster. In terms of the other countries, and we have Indonesia and Philippines have also been doing well. Malaysia actually has not been doing that badly. I mean, last year the growth rate was estimated to be 5.9, but maybe it's sugar-coated pre-election year. You know. But still, you know, in terms of economic growth, Thailand is much worse. If you look at Thailand, which is the gray row, you see that our growth since actually after the financial crisis in 1997 has never picked up to the level anywhere near close to where we were before the Asian financial crisis. And last year, 2017, growth picked up to 3.9%. So it's close to 4%. When you look at these growth figures, you have to bear in mind that there are also differences in population growth. A country may grow at 5%, but if the population growth is 2%, then GDP per capita is only growing by 3%. So the differences in population can also explain some differences in economic growth. For example, Malaysian average population growth rate between 2010 to 2016 was 1.72%, whereas Thailand is 0.38. So there is already a big gap of 1.3% in difference. So while Malaysia is growing better than Thailand by 2 percentage points in GDP terms, but in per capita GDP terms, it's around 0.7. So it's much closer than that. So that's another aspect you have to bear in mind. This is the historical growth rates of Thailand. You can see that back in the 60s and up to 95 or before the Asian financial crisis, Thailand economic growth was very high. We were one of the top ranked in terms of ASEAN. But since then, growth has been low, and then last year began to pick up a bit. So we go and look at the source of growth, particularly for the last couple of years. This growth for the case of Thailand, year-on-year growth by quarter from beginning of 2006 to the end of 2007. And here, this graph is showing real consumption growth. And if you look at this, you can see that in terms of private consumption, which are obviously much bigger than public consumption, the growth rate has not changed that much. So it really follows GDP growth. If GDP is about 3 to 4%, then private consumption growth is about 3 to 4%. So it's not a leader of growth, but it's a follower of growth. It depends on what, how fast GDP is growing. But public consumption also has been relatively low, especially if you look at 2007. The growth is almost close to zero. So public expenditure in the last couple of years has not really been a big stimulus to growth. Okay. Next one, we look at real investment. Since the financial crisis in 1997, investment in Thailand and in most countries in ASEAN have really collapsed in terms of its ratio to GDP. Before the Asian financial crisis, investment to GDP ratio in Thailand was over 40%. After the financial crisis, it dropped very sharply to around between 20 and 25%. So you're talking about a 20 percentage point drop in the ratio of investment to GDP. That ratio has hardly picked up at all. From 1997 to the present, begin to pick up a little bit in the last year. You can see the red line there is private investment and grows a little bit, 3%, which is not very high. Again, public investment, you can see that last year actually declined compared to the year before. But this will change, and that's I will come to later, because we are now investing huge amounts in new mass transit projects around Bangkok area. I think in terms of the stimulus from the public sector, we have room to increase. Okay, we are not worrying so much about public debt because the guideline used to be back 20, 30 years ago that we try to keep public debt to GDP ratio less than 50%. But then after the financial crisis, then the public sector had to revive the financial sector to clear up bad debts and so on. So public debt went over 50%. But since then it's come down. And ever since it's been relatively low, less than 50%. And now it's around 41, 42%. So there's still room for more public expenditure, which is exactly what we're doing in terms of increasing public investment. Export. You can see clearly that export picked up last year. And if you look at data carefully, follow monthly data on export, we could already tell at the beginning of last year that 2017 would be a pickup year for trade and for GDP for almost many, many countries around the world. So the yellow or orange line there is export of merchandise export, whereas the blue line is export of services. So in the case of merchandise export, starting around the end of 2006 to the present, you can see the growth rate has been picking up. And the last 2 quarters, growth rate has been more than double digit. And services growth has been performing very well, even back to the beginning of 2016. And of course, in Thailand, the big item in services export is tourism, which we'll look in more detail later. So this figure shows export growth for the orange bar is for total merchandise export. Green bar is for food and agriculture export, because Thailand is a big exporter of food and agriculture. The light blue line is non-food manufacturing, which is the biggest chunk of export, but it consists of different parts, which is, again, composition is changing. And then the purple line is tourism. And you can see that tourism growth has been performing very well. If you look at tourist arrivals, the blue line is Thailand, and the orange bar is Malaysia. And you can see that over the last 5 years, Thailand has really shot up, whereas Malaysia has been stuck at around 26, 27 million. Thailand last year was already above 35 million. So this is a big source of income for Thailand. And if you compare total tourism receipts, Thailand, actually, the receipts is even bigger than China, okay? And here, comparing different countries. In the case of Thailand, if you look at tourism receipts of GDP, it's also very high. It's around 13% of GDP, whereas for the other countries are much lower. Malaysia is only around 6%. And for the Thai case, the ratio of tourism receipts to GDP has been increasing. It's on an uptrend, which is a good thing. It's particularly good because if you look at the multiplier effect of supply and demand, tourism is one source of income with very high multiplier, because tourists come, they spend on hotel, they spend on food, they spend on travel, and it percolates throughout the whole economy. They buy products made by craftspeople in different provinces and so on. So multiplier impact of tourism is 1.22, as estimated by the model that I use. And food and agriculture export is also very high, 1.35. Non-food manufacturing export is less than 1, okay, because a lot of it are imported intermediate product and so on. Next item is to show that exchange rate matter, okay, because when we talk about export, the data I show you there were export or tourism income in US dollar. But what matters is also income in domestic currency, because that's what you use to pay workers and so on. And here you can see that exchange rate have impact which vary over the years. Last year, the orange line there is export growth in US dollar. Green line, export growth in baht, local currency. And you see a difference there, almost 5%. So last year, the baht strengthened, okay, and that's why the income in domestic currency is less than income from US dollar. Whereas in some other years, for example, in 2016, income based on US dollar was almost zero. But income in baht terms was positive by about 3% because the baht weakened by about 3%. So monetary policy has impact directly through the trade side on the performance of the economy. And in the case of Thailand, over the last year or so, the real effective exchange rate has been increasing, and the nominal effective exchange rate have been increasing. The blue line is the nominal effective exchange rate. It means because we're trading with many countries, using many different currencies, so nominal effective exchange rate is to weight the exchange rate of our trading partners based on how much we trade with them in nominal terms. And you can see that when the line goes up, it means the Thai baht has been strengthening compared to our trading partner, which means, of course, that competitiveness become less. Whereas the orange line takes into account differences in inflation among countries that we trade with as well. So it's real effective exchange rate. And you can see the line is still going up over the last couple of years. And this means that we're losing competitiveness compared to our trading partners. So I think the monetary authority need to pay more attention to managing the exchange rate based on what's happening to the effective exchange rate. Now, I was involved with helping to set up the inflation targeting framework in Thailand. Before the financial crisis in '97, we had fixed exchange rate to the dollar or to a basket where the dollar is the major weight. But when we floated after the baht, then you had to provide a monetary anchor to the exchange rate. So many countries adopted so-called inflation targeting. And I was appointed to be on the monetary policy board, the first monetary policy board in Thailand back in 1999-2000. And so we had to develop the framework from nothing, because before that we used fixed exchange rate. So people didn't understand what is inflation targeting. The media didn't understand, markets didn't really understand in Thailand anyway. So it was important at that time to create a system where we can maintain credibility of the system. So instead of targeting a particular figure of inflation, say 2%, we target a range, because that would ensure that we can keep the rate, the target rate, within the range over a sufficient long period of time to create credibility with the market. So when we started, we target between 0 to 3.5. Of course, it's quite wide, but it's to make sure that you can maintain that range. And we also target not headline inflation, but rather core inflation, which takes out the price of energy and the price of raw food, because these tend to be volatile. And for example, if energy price goes up, it will put pressure on your headline inflation. And we don't want to punish the economy twice. First, from the impact of the high oil price. Secondly, from having to increase interest rate to try to reduce headline inflation. So that's why we use core inflation. And over the 14 years, between 2000 to 2014, we managed to maintain the core inflation rate within the range, apart from just a few months. So the performance was very good. Of course, I already said for a short time in the monetary policy board, but then ever since, they've been able to maintain the range. And you see that after around 2009, the range was narrowed a little bit because they have more confidence that can maintain the range. Unfortunately, after 2015, I don't know, I don't understand the reason, but many bankers, central bankers around the world say that targeting core inflation, people don't understand because they only understand headline inflation. So they shifted back, they changed the target to headline inflation. And then the range is 1 to 4% of headline inflation. Unfortunately, the timing was very bad. And ever since then, there have only been a few months, 3 or 4 months, where they actually managed to get into the range. So it's been outside range all the way through. And what's worse is that if you look at the green line, the blue line, which is the policy rate, that declined at the beginning of 2014. Since then, even though the inflation has been below the range throughout, the policy target, the policy rate has not changed at all. And even the IMF criticized this and said that Thailand should lower the policy rate because our currency is getting strong, too strong compared to our competitor. And if you lower policy rate, that may help to reduce the value of the baht compared to other currency. So this is quite a controversial subject in Thailand at the moment. Now the upswing in 2017, where did that come from? Well, it came from an upswing in world trade. Okay, this is data from WTO. Monthly export globally. It covers 70 countries, and I would guess it will be more than 95% of world trade, because the other countries not covered are small countries. And you can see that here there are ups and downs. Now the first drop, okay, you can see that it's around 2009. That was the result of the global financial crisis. The shortages after the closure of Lehman Brothers, there was an acute shortage of US dollar in the world. Trade finance almost collapsed, and that's why trade collapsed. So you see a big drop, but then that only lasted for a short time, and then the bounce back. So during the bounce back, growth in world trade was quite high. And then when it reached just above the previous peak, you will see they begin to, the growth was positive, but begin to slow down. And then we had another drop in 2005, and that came from decline in commodity prices and also slowdown in emerging markets, particularly China. So you see that drop. And then we are now in a phase of upswing, starting around the end of 2016. And that's why every country last year experienced growth in export, because world trade was increasing. So the question is really, and here if you look at 3-month moving average, you can see the trend is still up, or 6-month moving average, the trend is still up. So the question is really what's ahead, and we'll come back to that later. Now this upswing in world trade affected positively almost every country and every region in the world. So we are not anything special compared to other countries, because the whole world is picking up, because world trade was picking up. And here, this table here shows quarterly export value growth, this is in value terms, of many countries and regions. For example, it covers the US, Europe, Asia, including some countries like China, Japan, Korea, ASEAN 4. ASEAN 4 because I leave out Singapore. And the reason is that in Singapore, most of their exports are re-exported. That is, for example, if Thailand was exporting to, say, some European country, some of the shipments actually go to Singapore first and transfer into huge container ships and then re-exported. But unfortunately, Singapore does not report the data for re-export. So if you look at export figure for Singapore, most of it is re-export, 95%. But then we can't separate out how much of that is actually export produced in Singapore compared to just simply re-export. That's why I only use ASEAN 4. So last year, basically, there was a pickup in trade everywhere, okay? And if you look at the fourth quarter data, it's still positive, still reasonably good growth. And this it gives less anxiety about what's happening this year, but there are other sources of anxiety which we'll come to in a minute. Next, we can look at volume, because last table was on value. Now, value may increase because price has been going up, but this one is looking at volume, so not looking at the price effect. And here you can see also that looking at the volume, also positive last year compared to 2016. So volume is also been increasing almost everywhere. And in terms of real GDP growth, it's mixed. Countries which export is an important driver of growth obviously benefited. Many countries in ASEAN have benefited in terms of faster GDP growth, like Thailand. Last year we grew by 3.9. Malaysia also benefited because of the high export growth. But other countries where export is more maybe a smaller part of their economy or less of a driver will have less impact on the real GDP growth. Now, what about looking ahead? Well, I looked at the data on trade, and then I just, actually, it was just a hunch. So I also plotted the orange line there, which is the average price of crude oil. And I was shocked to find that the turning point coincide very well between world trade and the turning point of the price of crude oil. Now, if, say, crude oil increase, then obviously we trade in crude oil, we trade in energy, because the price of crude oil go up. So obviously this has some impact on the value of trade. But you cannot explain the value of trade by crude oil, because crude oil trade, or not just crude oil, energy trade globally accounts for only 11% of world trade. So the increase in price of energy cannot explain trade. So there's other things going on which may explain both turning points. And if you look at this, well, the right side of the orange line, there's still an upswing. It will be a bit too early to say whether, you know, we're going to be close to another turning point or not. We need data for a few more months, I think, to see whether, in fact, energy price. We get data for energy prices or crude oil prices 2 months before data on trade. So if you follow data on crude oil price or energy price, it may give some forward, you know, hint of what might happen to world trade. But I don't guarantee that this turning point coincidence will hold forever. It just happened that I plotted it, it happened to hold in this case. Next thing is ASEAN is very diverse. Okay, there are two aspects. One is GDP per capita, and you see, even if we ignore Singapore and Brunei, which are city-states, you really cannot compare Singapore to, say, Thailand. You have to compare Singapore to Bangkok. So so anyway, they are very small and they're very rich. So even if they don't grow, they're still rich. So we don't have to be so concerned about the growth of these small city-states. Malaysia actually is not doing that badly. GDP per capita now more than 9,000 US dollars. Of course, you want it to be 20,000, but you know, it takes time. Thailand, 6,000. It would take longer for us. But the diversity actually has impact. It means that for richer countries, cost of production is higher. For poorer countries, cost of production is lower. So you naturally see attraction of production facilities or movement from the richer countries maybe more to the poorer countries. So that's one aspect, income per capita. Next aspect is GDP size. If your GDP size is large, like China, then you have big market. So this is attractive for people to invest and to produce things to sell in the market. Although in the case of ASEAN, we try to make ASEAN more of a single market. So actually, you don't have to produce in the country to sell to that country. You can produce in Vietnam and sell to Thailand, because tariff is almost zero. And here you can see that Indonesia is the largest country in ASEAN, followed by Thailand, Philippines, Singapore, Malaysia, etc. What this means is that you can expect changing patterns of foreign direct investment. And this table shows that very clearly. So it looks at the net FDI, that's inflow minus outflow. Between 2001 to 2005, 2006 to 2010, 2011 to 2016, the pattern has changed. If you look at, say, for example, Thailand, 2001 to 2005, on average, each year we get net FDI inflow of 3.3% of GDP. Okay. 2006 to 2010, this declined to 2.1%. And then 2011 to 2016 became negative. Also, in case of Malaysia, also negative. And these are the two richest countries in ASEAN, not counting Brunei and Singapore. So cost of production in Malaysia and Thailand is already getting high, much higher compared to other newer ASEAN member countries. The most attractive country right now is Vietnam. And you can see that 2006 to 2010, 6.8% of net FDI inflow per year. Between 2011 to 2016, 4.8% per year. So they're really attracting a lot of FDI. Indonesia also used to be negative, now positive, although much less than Vietnam. Vietnam is probably now the largest exporter of electrical and electronic products. They've already overtaken Malaysia. Okay. Now, what is it that they're selling or exporting that is now pushing their value of export to be so high? One item accounts for a lot: telephones, mobile phones. So big investment by Korea, Samsung, in Vietnam to produce mobile phone, and that basically pushed the value of their export up. Other export also been increasing, but mobile phone is basically the biggest item. In terms of auto export, Thailand is still doing very well, much higher than other ASEAN countries. And the question is really looking down the road, because the market in Indonesia is now bigger than in Thailand, and because they have large population, high population growth, and also good economic growth, their market will continue to grow. But in terms of production, Thailand is much higher. How can we maintain this in the medium to long term? Short-term outlook, just a couple more slides. Merchandise export, I think, is still an uptrend, but it's likely to slow down compared to 2017. Just simply looking at, we're reaching the previous peak, and usually when you get near the previous peak, you have a slowdown. Also, you have risk factor, Trump effect, the possibility of major trade wars. And this could actually reverse the growth in world trade, and we can begin another downturn, and that would be very bad for everybody. Tourism is still very strong. In January, still 11% year-on-year growth. Interest rate uptrend in the US should weaken the baht, and this will help income from export in baht terms to increase. And then public investment should pick up substantially. These are the different mass transit lines we are doing right now. And now when I leave home, no matter which way I go, the roads have been blocked up, one lane here, two lanes there, because they're beginning construction of the either the subway or new SkyTrain. And you see, this is happening everywhere in Bangkok. So that's why the traffic is getting worse, and it will be worse for the next 3 or 4 years. But anyway, if we finish all these lines, the infrastructure in Bangkok would then be close to that you find in advanced economies. And then looking ahead, just briefly, I think you need to focus, or Thailand needs to focus more on sources of permanent comparative advantage. Food and agriculture, personal services, tourism, etc. manufacturing is not a permanent source of comparative advantage, because at some point they can move easily to, they're quite footloose. But of course, in the case of Thailand, because of the auto sector, we are still dominant in ASEAN. So we need to have good strategy to maintain that dominance over the next 10 to 20 years. And we need to develop new industry, particularly related to mega projects. For example, we don't have any industry related to rail, okay? Because we're investing so much in rail, whether it's in mass transit or connecting to neighboring countries, that's where we should have more focus. And then we need to make use of geographical location of Thailand as a center of GMS to expand the links to neighboring countries, to the east, to the north, to the west, and use that to develop the border areas of Thailand, which is still relatively poor compared to the Bangkok or central areas. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Dr. Chalongphob's last few slides, I guess, is a good place for me to start. The world economy, as he illustrated from the WTO data, has been doing well, right? The world trade did very well in the years 2007, 2008, 2013, 2014, and 2017 is slightly better than any of those years, okay? So the momentum is carrying into 2018. And with President Trump, who is pro-business growth, by right, if the US grow well, I think it should give us further momentum. But on the other hand, he's also starting to introduce protectionism. The duties on the steel and aluminum and the threat of trade war, I think is what's giving some anxiety, okay? So that's what I'm trying to discuss a little bit. Now, because of time, I'm going to try to compress it, and maybe I give you the conclusion before I go to the slides. All the commentaries about President Trump has been from the angle of seasoned politicians, statesmen, economists, but really, he's a businessman. And even more important than that, he's a businessman who has been running family business. The character of businessman who runs a major family business is rather different from a senior executive who runs a major conglomerate. You are used to doing what you want. You do things by observing a few things. You don't care too much about check and balances. You don't have the patience for it. I think if we were to look at him from this angle, I think perhaps his action will be more understandable and perhaps more predictable going into the future. Economies, I think to him are all fakes, okay? I mean, yours truly is also a fake professor, and President Trump loves to say everything else that's negative to him are fake news, okay? So I think if you bear that in mind, we can go on, all right? This is a very quick summary of what I'm going to talk to you. Okay, a lot of it is on the aluminum and steel, but I would also talk about whether he's just targeting China or more, and why is he doing what he's doing, and finally the impact on ASEAN. Okay, so I think you can read it faster than what I can talk. These are some quotes as to why he's doing what he's doing. Who is he hearing from? Okay. Okay. So why is he putting so much emphasis on steel and aluminum? And would these two things really have a big impact on the world? What I'm trying to show you is that Actually, steel and aluminum imports into the US is really a very small part of total US trade. Okay? And they have been under control. Okay? US import of steel have been hovering around 30 million tons, which is roughly 25% of total US consumption. Okay? Of course, it has been creeping up over the years, but when there's a certain spurt, then there will be anti-dumping duties, countervailing duties, and that will bring it back down under control. Okay? And similarly on aluminum, right? So if things are basically under control, why do you do it? Okay? Why are you introducing a flat duty at this point in time? Okay? And really, who destroyed the US steel and aluminum industry? Okay? I think from this little chart, you can see that the US steel output has dropped significantly for more than 30 years. Okay? It dropped in the 1980s. Why did it happen then? Basically because US steel mills have been established for a very long time. There are all sorts of legacy costs, okay? Retirement benefit, etc., that you have given away very generous retirement benefits, and as your costs increase and your profit drops, and then imports come in, you're under pressure, okay? And of course, the leading steel mill, the biggest was US Steel. They decided that oil business is better, and they diversify into oil and gas and make a mess of it before they come back to steel, okay? So this same story happened to all the major steel mills in the US in the 1980s. However, on the other hand, you have a new company called Nucor that started small in the 1970s and became the biggest steel mill by now because they have been investing, okay? They have been investing in new technology. They are not doing primary steel refining. They are doing recycling of scrap and the melting, okay? So you can see that the industry is responding to the dynamics of the market, okay? And if you lose competitiveness, you must ask why. A lot of it is internal rather than external, okay? Let's go on to talk about aluminum. I think aluminum in a way is even more interesting, okay? Aluminum and steel are both very, very capital intensive and energy intensive. Aluminum even more so than steel, okay? So for aluminum smelting to do well, the country must have cheap and ample supply of energy. And the financial institution must be willing to extend finance in a big way and for long term, okay? So what happened to the US? Well, you remember Amron? Okay? During that time, California ran short of energy, okay? In both supply and prices. So during that period of time, 10 smelters closed down. 5 of them never restarted, and of the 10 that shut down, by now only 1 is still producing, okay? Then in the financial crisis of 2007, 2008, 5 more were shut down, okay? Because the banks did not want to continue and because the economics was not right, okay? Again, in other words, internal factors, more than external factors, cause the decline of the US aluminum industry, okay? Now let's look at other countries, those who have done well, okay? What has happened? In the case of aluminum and steel and copper and so on and so forth, China's big rise to become the manufacturer of the world obviously provided the market for all this to grow. But in the case of aluminum, it is also very important. You know, they develop new technology, okay? And I have here a quote for you from competitor. This I extracted from the annual report of Hydro, which is a Norwegian company. Okay, the Chinese aluminum industry has developed new process so that the energy cost, energy consumption per metric ton is the lowest in the world. In the next slide, I will show you that. And the cost of energy is also low, okay? Look at this table and you can see it, right? You look at the contrast. US, short of energy, high energy prices that kill the aluminum industries. I'm talking about smelting. Huh? If you're doing downstream processing, it's a different issue. But you look at China, the energy consumption is more than 1,000 kilowatt hour per metric ton, lower than that in other places. Okay? Now, at roughly 6-7 US cents per metric ton, that translates to 60-70 US dollar per ton, and that is a lot in terms of competitiveness. Okay? In the same table, you can see why some other countries are surviving despite the Chinese rise in aluminum production and export. In Norway and Canada and Russia, where all their smelters are dependent on hydroelectric power, they have survived and they have done well. Okay? So I think, do we blame everybody else for our own problem? The answer shouldn't be as an economist, or even as a businessman. But if you are involved in those industries and you don't want to die, then you blame everybody else. Okay? In particular, if you are an economist and you look at things a bit more objectively, China, that has been a culprit in the pressure on all of us. You know where I came from, the steel industries before. Because the Chinese were dumping their excess capacity not only below cost, but below cash cost. And this peaked in 2015. This was when Chinese export of all these commodity products peaked and the prices were the lowest. But for their own reasons, because all the industries involving in this trade were losing big bucks. In the second half of 2015, the top 100 steel mills in China lost 10 billion US. And that's after taking into account profit they make from non-steel business. Okay? And of course, the pollution is phenomenal, right? All of you must have read in the press about how choking and that you can't see in Beijing. Okay? For all these reasons, the Chinese have started to control. Okay? And therefore, prices started to rise from the second half of 2016, and everybody started to make money. The Chinese steel mills, American steel mills, Southeast Asian steel mills. Okay? Similarly for aluminum. So why do you need to now attack these two industries? Okay? On top of that, unprecedented, the Chinese are now ordering the major polluting heavy industries near Beijing, and that's where the bulk of them are resided, to stop production or control production by 50% in the winter months from middle of November until middle of March. So the conditions are all ripe for these industries outside of China to do well. So why? Okay? And also, is Trump targeting only China? I would think not. Why? Because actually Chinese surplus have been coming down. But the US deficit is still rising. So again, that tells you the basic problem are very different. Huh? So why? Tell me why. You need to have all these tariffs, okay? I think the problem is that he's a businessman, he listens to businessmen. Okay? Now, if you are in business, although you have WTO for you to control dumping, and the Americans have been very good in doing them, when you file, unfortunately, you have to file by product, by country. So it becomes a tedious process. But the US, more than any other country, when Malaysian steel mills filed for protection against dumping, it took the Malaysian government 5 years before they would do anything. We were one of the last to do it. And we gave very grudgingly 14.5%. In the US, when the anti-dumping or countervailing duty came in, they were punitive. Okay? They ranged from 35-40% 5-7 years ago to now 150%, even 200%. Okay? But if you are a businessman in the heavy industries where the gestation period is long, you say, that's no good. I want a blanket protection so that I have certainty. Okay? Especially because the prices are good, the companies are making money, investment in US steel and aluminum industries have started again in the last 2 years. Okay? So, let's look at the background of some of the people who our dear president listens to. Secretary of Commerce, okay? Wilbur Ross. He made his billion or millions, hundreds of millions, by buying up 5 bankrupt US steel companies. Okay? Put some money in them, when they turn around, flip it and sold it to Mittal, who is now part of the ArcelorMittal, the biggest steel mill in the world. Okay? So he knows a little bit about steel. Well, he also listened to Nucor, the CEO of Nucor, right? You can read what does the CEO of Nucor says. Okay? He's complaining that filing by product, by country is no good. Okay? And all these words gets through to President Trump. So, what happened when a businessman listened to businessman friend? That's what you get. Okay? I'm going to jump on a little bit more quickly. I made this point that he's a businessman running his own family business, right? But you know, to say that he hasn't thought about this is also wrong. Okay? I will come back to the question, why you use aluminum and steel? Okay? When the impact on the US trade and economy is so little, right? The two of them added up to be less than 2% of total US import. Okay? And the impact of China is even less. What is 1 million ton of steel in the context of Chinese export? Okay? It is important a little bit more to Canada as far as aluminum is concerned. Okay? But President Trump also came up very quickly to say that, oh, Australia, you're a good friend. And of course, you remember one of the previous Australian Prime Minister said that let us be the sheriff for the Americans in Southeast Asia, right? So immediately you're exempted. Okay? For Canada and Mexico, oh yeah, you're also a friend, right? You can be exempted if we make progress on NAFTA, renegotiation, okay? Right? But no mention of exemption for EU. No mention of exemption for China. Okay? Why? Because he wants to break up the existing multilateral mechanism of trade. Because he feels that as the biggest and wealthiest nation, he has the bargaining power. Okay? And can get better advantage in a bilateral negotiation. So if you ask me, this is a poker game. I'm choosing something that's relatively minor, then giving you the warning. Okay? I have been complaining since before the election that I want to renegotiate. But none of you have responded to a bilateral negotiation. So I give you a little slap on your wrist. Will you respond? Okay? So are we going to have a trade war? I guess a lot depends on whether some progress can be made on the bilateral trade. And of course, you also know that he has told the special delegation that President Xi sent to visit the US, Liu He, and say that, give me 100 billion. In his tweet, he made a mistake, he said 1 billion. But later on, they clarified, they wanted 100 billion of proposal from the Chinese to reduce the trade deficit. Okay? So there you are. All these are the indications that our businessman president is playing poker. He wants his agenda of bilateral negotiation to improve the terms. Okay? But in the process, he wants to show his supporter, the businessman, and his core supporter, the blue collar. Remember, last week there was an election, okay, near Pittsburgh, a steel area. And his campaign speech there was, see what I've done for you, okay? So I think that is the gist of what I want to talk about. As far as possibly the trade war is always there. So now let's see how it gets played out. Now let me just quickly talk about the impact on Southeast Asia. Steel and aluminum are not important, okay, for us, because we are not really a big net exporter on this product. In fact, we are a big net importer. In case there's a trade war, and if everybody retaliate, if we don't try to be too altruistic, we also put import duty. Because we're net importer, I think our steel and aluminum company should do great, okay? But if you want to be stupid and say that other people protect theirs and we don't, too bad, okay? Now, the biggest danger to me, okay, because we are all quite dependent on the EE, electronic and electrical industries, okay? If the so-called trade war spill over to this sector, then we can be hit very hard. However, this is one of the products in the world where the global supply chain has been really developed. And if he were to try to attack that, then countries on both sides of the Pacific, okay, from California, Washington, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, of course China, Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore, will all be impacted, okay? And I think, depending on how it is done, it is difficult to forecast how that will impact us, okay? But I would expect that that will be towards the end of the chain, rather than early part of the whole thing, okay? When you're faced with challenges in business and economy, every few years, there's a major change. We have to be ready for it. How can we get ready for it? I think we have to strengthen our own internal system. I think Tan Sri Lin has spoken a little bit about it. Chalongphob has spoken a little bit about it. You know, the world that's coming up, we are seeing a lot of disruption, a lot of fundamental changes, right? Big data, artificial intelligence, all these are very important things for the longer term. And in order to participate in this, you need to have very good human resource. You need people who are able to participate in things like that, right? And that means that our education, starting from primary school to high school, even before you talk about colleges and universities, okay? Now, what is the problem with education in this part of the world, and I think especially Malaysia? We are giving too much emphasis on non-math, non-science, okay? You just have to look at the percentage of graduates, okay? And that's also the source of a lot of graduate unemployment. If we don't want to correct this and correct this from primary school onwards, I think we will be in trouble, okay? I think that was the key point that Professor Perkins was trying to make last year, okay? I think there will be particular universities that we can be at the forefront of the ranking. But even if that happens, so what? Do you have enough number of quality people? And I think that's where the key thing that must happen, okay? If we can do that, and because we are a small country, Chalongphob's data has shown bigger country can attract investment. Okay, ASEAN, we are mainly competitors. We are not really complementing one another. But if you ask me as a businessman or economist, when you're competitors and you're willing to give up those that you are really not competitive, that free up resources, okay? And if you have a common market, that gives you the base to attract investment, okay? I think, and if you do your human resource correct, you have the people to deal with it, I think ASEAN can grow very fast and we can grow past any of these kind of challenges and crises. On the other hand, if you are not willing to deal with it, if we are always hiding behind politics, okay, then we will have trouble. If you remember 1978 crisis, okay, that was when we overspent. We have current account, we have current account deficits, okay. I think we have seen enough from both the positive side and negative side to know what we should do, okay? But if politics gets into the way, sorry for ASEAN, okay? That's all, thank you very much.
First of all, give a round of applause to all the three speakers for a great job well done. Now, since time is short, I will not try to summarize, but it is better that we take questions. So I'm going to allow 5 questions, please. So let's have the...
Good morning, everyone. Thank you to all the 3 speakers. I learned a lot from all of you. So I have 3 questions here. So for the first questions, I would like to get some insightful information from Tan Sri Dr. Lin, which is related to our nation public debt. So according to the Malaysian government, the current public debt is not a worrying figure. So from the data, it seems that we have already had more than 50% of GDP as our public debt. So could you please advise us on what is the so-called worrying figure for us? That's question number 1. Question number 2 is for Dr. Chalongphob. So just now you mentioned about tourist arrival in Malaysia is actually more than 25 million people. And in 2016, for tourist receipts, we have 6% of GDP. So what is your view on the effect of tourism tax to the tourism industry in Malaysia? My third question is to Prof. Dato Dr. Tan. Since Trump economics policy is always giving us lots of surprise, so what is your view on the effect of economic policy uncertainty to economic growth, particularly to the Southeast Asia and China? Thank you.
Earlier, Tan Sri mentioned that the diplomats are not moving things fast enough in ASEAN. So my question to all of you is, do we need someone like Trump in ASEAN to get things moving? By the way, I support Trump because I think it's good to be selfish sometimes. We can't be taking care of other people's kids. Sometimes we need to take care of our own. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. And the panel, congratulations. I think you have got us really thinking. We seem to be doing pretty well now. The world economy also is on the right track as of now. But you also pose the great challenges we face in the future. Now, can the panel advise as to how governments, especially in ASEAN, in Southeast Asia, can be persuaded that they got to look beyond the horizon and that they got to plan together and they got to organize themselves in order to face the new challenges. If the politicians want to play politics, how can the people get the politicians and the leaders to move forward rather than be complacent? Thank you.
The first question about debt, your figures are correct. But what is missing in those figures are government guaranteed debt. As you know, we have a lot of SOEs, that is government-owned companies. They're all boring left, right, center. And most of them have a letter of comfort from government, which is interpreted as equivalent to guarantees. Nobody knows exactly how much guarantees there are. That's where the worry is. So the government is very smart. The budget looks clean. The debt looks clean. But there's a lot of shit around the other side. Yeah. Second, the Trump for ASEAN, I think it's a fresh idea. Yeah. As I say, the politics in ASEAN stinks, certainly in Malaysia. I'm sure the Thais and the Vietnamese would say something like that. So maybe we need a breath of fresh air to encourage a new breed of politicians to come in. One of the things I was talking to some people yesterday who attended our seminars, and he was saying that Malaysia is looking at the possibility of professional politicians, whether that is a good idea. That means the politicians will draw salaries like a public servant, and then we try to get away with the politics that way. But, you know, I've been in this business 60 years, an idea of that doesn't work. The politicians somehow will surface somewhere else or in different guises. So, to answer you directly, yeah, we need a breath of fresh air, but I'm not sure exactly what it's going to be. Raymond, I think you and I have been talking about reforms, but somehow or other it doesn't sink. They say surely we'll do it. They even pass in cabinet, but they are not implemented. And that's the problem. And once we get to implementation, you and I know that the problem goes beyond politics. The civil service, the machinery, and things like that. And so I think we have to keep on knocking at the door and sometimes just knocking at the walls. But hopefully one day, maybe with a breath of fresh air, we might be able to get something done.
There's a question about the tourist tax. I'm not sure, what that is because we don't have it in Thailand. Basically, if you tax them, they simply spend less in the country. So it's better to encourage more of them to come and then encourage them to spend. Because you tax them anyway. They have to pay, GST or whatever. But I just want to add a little bit about the debt. And I want to add particularly on foreign debt. Here, if you look at the ratio of foreign debt to GDP, or for Malaysia, it looks higher than other countries, but that is because the definitions are different. Okay, and this is very important because sometimes if you don't compare like with like, you create loss of confidence in the market. Now, the way that Malaysia measure it is, I think, the correct way. Normally, when you talk about foreign debt, is the debt you owe to foreigners in foreign currencies. Say you borrow from abroad in US dollar. So that's counted as foreign debt. But at the same time, if foreigners deposit money in your bank or buy your stocks and bonds in local currency, normally in other countries, they don't regard that as foreign debt. But in my view, it should be regarded as foreign debt because the foreigners who hold your deposit in ringgit, they can always convert to dollar and take the money out. So the Malaysian measure is much better reflection of the risk. But if you compare Malaysian figure with Thailand figure, of course it looks, well, how come Malaysia is much higher? So I think that, you have to compare like with like. And I think Malaysia tried to explain, but they have not done enough PR to explain really this is why the figures are different. It doesn't mean that Malaysian situation is worse than in other countries.
Okay, let me comment a little bit on the debt situation. For those of you who are not familiar, letter of comfort can come in many shades. Okay, The official debt is about 50%. The letter of guarantee means that they are very specific. You must honor, I think adds up to be another slightly less than 10%. Okay? What we really don't know are the letter of comforts. How many are there? Okay? And how are they worded? Whether you can get out of it. Okay? But there is a big difference between a company issuing a letter of comfort and a country issuing a letter of comfort. Because if you dishonor a letter of comfort, it will impact your future ability to borrow. So if you're a company, you dishonor, you die. Okay? It doesn't stop you from creating another company to try to borrow. But as a country, the impact is actually rather different. Okay? So I think we have to get a clear picture of how much letter of comfort are there really, okay, in order to address your question. Let me touch very quickly on the tourism also. Malaysia's tourism figure includes Singapore. As you know, there are a lot of flow back and forth between Singapore and Malaysia. And a lot of these are not tourists. Okay? So until we clean out this data, I don't think we'll see a very clear picture of the development of our tourism industry, which is of course a lot smaller than Thailand. Okay? But I suspect if you take out the Singapore figures, it has been growing. Okay? So I think we need to try to deal with that. The last question is on the uncertainty. I thought I tried to address that already. You know, what President Trump is really trying to do and get at are not ASEAN. Okay? He is actually aiming China, Canada, Mexico, Germany in particular. These are all big countries, big economy, right? And we cannot forecast and predict who will respond how, and therefore what will be the next step. Okay? And that's why I said the important thing is we have to get ourselves ready. If we can have good people with good skill, and we can cooperate well amongst ourselves to weed out the inefficient industries and to grow in a new industry, we'll be okay. But if we are not willing or able to do that, and worse still, we allow politics to take precedent, we allow corruption to become worse, then good luck. Even if nothing happens in the international front, we will still walk ourselves into difficulties, okay? So I'm sorry I cannot provide you with clear answer. I can respond by saying that if you have a duty on aluminum, we are not a big exporter, okay? Our biggest company doing this is Press Metal, and Press Metal has already issued a statement to say that the export to the US is very little, okay? The Malaysian Iron and Steel Federation has also issued a statement saying that our export to US is very minimal, okay? But depending on how it develop with specific action, then we can say this will happen, that will happen, okay? I'm sorry, I still have to stick to that very general reply.
Can I just add about the Trump or ASEAN? We had that, you know. Mr. Thaksin is very similar to Mr. Trump. Self-made man, run family business, as you said. You know, he can do anything in a family business. Of course, he's more domestic. On the point about politics, I think the main thing about politics, obviously, they have much shorter time horizon. But as long as changes in politics does not lead to major changes in economic policy direction, that's really what you should be aiming at. In the UK, when I was studying, very young, they had what they call stop and go policy, because they had a Conservative Party and a Labour Party. So when the Conservative Party came into power, they privatized everything. And then when the change in government, the Labour Party came, they nationalized everything. And so that's why it stopped, go, and the country doesn't go anywhere. But if politics internally, of course, they will bicker, they will fight, whatever. But as long as the policy direction don't change, that's the key. If it changes, of course, that's a big problem, because businessmen can't, you know, they don't have certain environment to make their investment and so on.
As you all can see, there's a lot of issues to be discussed, and I think there are a lot more questions, but unfortunately time is, we have gone overboard. With time, we really have to stop there. So let us just give a round of applause to everyone that has given a very good seminar today. Thank you very much.